My name is Brittany, and I am 27 years old. I had spent years imagining the moment I would finally breathe, without pressure crushing my ribs the day I would choose myself without apology. That moment arrived quietly the morning I quit my job. There was no dramatic speech or slammed door, just a calm email and a trembling finger hovering over the send button. For years I had worked overtime, swallowed insults from clients, and lived inside a schedule that treated my life like an afterthought. I told myself it was temporary, that exhaustion was the price of stability, but stability never came, only deeper fatigue. So I walked away. 3 weeks later, after draining my savings and terrifying every practical voice in my head, I bought my dream beach house to heal. It wasn't a mansion, but to me it felt like a miracle, made of sunlight and salt air. The windows opened to endless blue water, with waves whispering instead of traffic screaming. The first evening I sat barefoot on the wooden deck, watching the horizon melt into gold, feeling something unfamiliar. Peace without conditions. That night, just as I began to believe I had escaped the noise of my past, my phone rang. My mother's name lit the screen, and a knot instantly formed in my stomach. I almost ignored it, but guilt is a stubborn habit, so I answered. She didn't greet me or ask how I was. Her voice carried the same authority, it always had the tone that assumed my compliance before I even spoke. "We are moving in tomorrow," your dad said. "It's fine," she said. For a second, my mind refused to process the sentence. The words floated there, absurd and heavy, and I just froze. The room suddenly felt smaller and the air tighter, as if the ocean itself had retreated. I managed a weak, confused laugh, thinking it had to be a joke, but silence answered me. Then she added, colder and sharper, that if I didn't like it, I could find somewhere else to live. The audacity of my mother's demand hit me like a physical blow. This was my house, my risk, my fragile attempt at rebuilding a life that had never truly belonged to me. Yet somehow, in her mind, it was already theirs. My hand shook so badly I had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. All the old emotions rushed back: anger, disbelief, and that familiar childhood helplessness that I thought I had left behind in the city. Growing up, my parents had always treated my achievements like communal property. My scholarships were family victories. My salary was family support. And any boundaries I tried to set were seen as mere inconveniences. Distance had not changed their expectations. It had only delayed them. I could hear my father faintly in the background, not speaking, just existing as silent reinforcement. That hurt more than if he had argued with her. I should have protested right then. I should have shouted that they had no right. But years of conditioning forced a false politeness into my voice. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. How long did they plan to stay? Why now? And what about my own need for space? My mother brushed everything aside with casual entitlement, speaking of my sanctuary like a vacation rental they had booked on a whim. When the call finally ended, the house that had felt like a paradise minutes earlier now felt invaded and contaminated by the weight of their arrival. I paced the living room for hours, rage and panic wrestling inside me. Selling the house was impossible, and letting them take over was unthinkable. Every scenario I imagined left me cornered. But beneath the fear, something else began to form, a slow, steady clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trapped in their house under their roof, dependent on their approval. This time, the ground was mine, the rules were mine, and suddenly the trembling stopped. My anxiety hardened into resolve. If they wanted to claim my peace, they would have to confront a version of me they had never met. By dawn, my shock had transformed into a meticulous plan. I replayed my mother's words over and over, not as a threat, but as a countdown. They expected obedience, accommodation, and eventual surrender. They expected the same Brittany who always bent, adjusted, and sacrificed. They had no idea how much I had changed during those weeks of silence. As sunlight flooded the room, I stood at the window staring at the waves. My parents believed they were arriving to occupy my home, but in reality, they were walking directly into a lesson years in the making. Morning arrived wrapped in a deceptive calm, the kind that makes everything look harmless just before something irreversible happens. I woke early not from anxiety, but from a strange electric focus. The plan I had shaped through the night sat firmly in my mind, clear and immovable. There would be no screaming match or emotional explosion that my parents could twist into proof of my instability. This would be precise, controlled, and unforgettable. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if preparing a stage for a performance where the ending was already written. Every object had a purpose now, and every detail mattered. By the time the sun climbed over the water painting, the waves in liquid gold, my beach house no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, a place where truth would finally speak without interruption. My parents arrived exactly as my mother had promised, their SUV rolling into the driveway with the confidence of people who believed they were expected and welcomed. I watched from the window, my heart steady and my hands no longer trembling. My mother stepped out first, scanning the property with open satisfaction, already treating it as hers. My father followed, carrying that same passive expression he had worn my entire life. Not cruel, but simply absent when it mattered most. They didn't knock, of course. My mother pushed the door open and entered like a victor crossing a finish line. "Brittany, you really should have cleaned the entryway," she called out, her voice echoing through my home. Criticism arrived before affection, as it always did. I greeted them with a calm smile that immediately unsettled her, because she expected resistance or forced enthusiasm, not this quiet composure. Before she could start complaining about the guest room, I said evenly that I had prepared something for them. Curiosity flickered across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion, while my father shifted uncomfortably. I led them into the living room, where 3 thick folders rested neatly on the table. The sight alone changed the air, because paperwork had never meant anything pleasant in our family unless it benefited them. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Receipts," I answered. "Agreements, records, and every documented expense connected to the last 10 years of my life." Confusion gave way to irritation, and she laughed dismissively, waving a hand as if to brush me away. She told me not to start with the drama because they had just driven for hours, but I didn't react. I simply opened the first folder and slid it toward her, showing her that the games were over. Inside that first folder were pages upon pages of bank transfers, loan repayments, utility bills, medical expenses, and insurance coverage. I had even documented every phone call where money was discussed. The color drained from my mother's face as understanding slowly replaced her arrogance. My father leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he saw the sheer volume of data I had compiled against them. I told them in a voice that was steady and almost detached that I had tracked every financial favor they ever claimed to have done for me. I reminded them of every time I was told that family helps family, usually as a way to guilt me into paying for their lifestyle. I pointed to a line item from 5 years ago when they claimed to have helped me with my first apartment. I showed them the proof that I had paid them back triple the amount in what they called interest, but what I now called exploitation. I documented every rent payment I made for their house, every emergency they invented, and every time my own independence was postponed just to ensure their comfort. My mother's composure began to fracture, and she asked me if I was seriously trying to bill my own parents for their upbringing. I corrected her immediately. I wasn't billing them for my childhood, I was establishing boundaries legally and permanently for my adulthood. The room grew heavy with the weight of the numbers. My father tried to speak, to tell me that I was being cold and that they were my flesh and blood, but I didn't let him finish. I told him that blood doesn't give anyone the right to occupy a home they didn't pay for or a life they didn't build. I showed them that according to my calculations, they actually owed me enough for a second down payment on another property. My mother tried to throw the folder on the floor, but I just picked it up and placed it back in front of her. I told her that she could scream all she wanted, but the numbers wouldn't change, and neither would the fact that they were standing in a house that belonged entirely to me. Then I reached for the second folder. This one contained the most important document of the day. I placed a single sheet of paper on top of the financial records, a formal short-term rental agreement, with their names already printed at the bottom. My mother stared at it in disbelief, her fury battling with a new sense of fear. I told them that they said they were moving in, and I was going to hold them to that, but not on their terms. If they wanted to stay in my house, they were going to stay as tenants. It would be temporary, it would be conditional, and most importantly, it would be respectful. They were no longer the landlords of my life, and I was no longer their servant. The explosion I had expected finally came with the force of a tidal wave. My mother's voice rose, to a pitch I had heard many times during my childhood, but this time it lacked the power to make me flinch. She called me selfish, ungrateful, and ridiculous. She paced my living room floor, her heels clicking sharply against the wood I had polished with such pride just days before. She accused me of being a monster for trying to force a contract on my own flesh and blood. "How dare you treat us like strangers," she screamed, while my father stood by the window looking out at the ocean as if he could disappear into the horizon. They used the familiar arsenal of guilt and outrage, trying to find the soft spots in my armor that they had spent decades creating. My mother threw her hands up in the air, declaring to the empty room that she had raised a daughter who was heartless and cold. But something extraordinary happened in those minutes of her shouting. For the first time in my life, her words had nowhere to land. They no longer controlled the air in the room or the beating of my heart. I sat there watching her perform her anger like a play I had seen 1,000 times, and I realized I knew all the lines. The house, the situation, and my future were no longer under her jurisdiction. My father, usually silent, finally spoke, his voice strained and heavy with disappointment. "Brittany," he said, shaking his head, "this is extreme. You are taking a simple family visit and turning it into a legal battle." I looked at him and replied quietly that what was truly extreme was assuming they could take over my life and my home whenever it suited them without asking. I told him that my extreme measures were only a response to their extreme entitlement. I pushed the rental agreement further toward the center of the table and handed my mother a pen. I told them clearly that the agreement included a set of house rules: no guests without my permission, no rearranging my furniture, and most importantly, a strict move-out date in 30 days. I explained that if they didn't sign it, they were guests who had overstayed their welcome before they even unpacked their bags. The confrontation stretched painfully as the reality of my resolve pressed against their expectations. My mother looked at the pen as if it were a poisonous snake. She was trapped between her desire to stay in a beautiful beach house for free and her pride, which refused to acknowledge me as an equal. For once, the silence that followed was mine to command, and I let it hang in the air until she realized I wasn't going to blink first. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating as my mother stared at the document on the table. For the first time in her life, she was facing a situation she couldn't manipulate with a guilt trip or a loud outburst. She looked at my father for support, but he remained focused on the waves outside, refusing to meet her eyes. The power dynamic that had defined our family for 27 years was shifting in real time. My mother's anger eventually began to give way to something much rarer for her, which was uncertainty. She looked around my living room, not with the gaze of an owner, but with the dawning recognition of a stranger who had been excluded from a circle she thought she controlled. I watched her face as she realized that her authority didn't travel with her across state lines. She had arrived believing that her presence alone was enough to claim the space, but she had encountered a closed system she could not dominate. I told them both that I loved them, and the sincerity in my voice seemed to stun them more than my anger ever could have. I explained that love without respect is just control wearing a kinder mask, and that era of our lives was over. I wasn't asking for an apology for the past, but I was demanding a different future. No shouting followed my words this time, just a heavy, uncomfortable stillness, as they stood there stripped of the assumptions they had carried for decades. Finally, with a hand that trembled with suppressed rage, my mother reached out and grabbed the pen. She signed her name with such force that the tip of the pen nearly tore through the paper. My father followed, signing with a weary sigh that sounded like the collapse of a long-held defense. They were officially my tenants now. I took the document and placed it carefully in the third folder along with their copies of the house rules. I told them that since they were now legal occupants, I would show them to the guest room, but I reminded them that my office and the master suite were strictly off-limits. The walk down the hallway was the longest of my life. My mother made passive-aggressive comments about the color of the walls and the quality of the linens, trying to reclaim some small shred of superiority by criticizing my taste. But her words felt thin and hollow, like echoes from a distant room. I didn't defend my choices because I didn't need her approval to enjoy them. When I left them in the guest room to unpack, I heard the door click shut, and for the first time in my own home, I felt a strange sense of victory. It wasn't the joyful kind I had imagined, but it was a victory of truth over tradition. The balance of power had shifted so completely that there was no room left for the old arguments. The following 2 weeks were a masterclass in tension and the slow erosion of my parents' confidence. They tried to test the boundaries I had set almost every single day. My mother would wake up early and try to reorganize my kitchen cabinets, claiming she was just trying to be helpful, but I would calmly spend the afternoon moving everything back to its original place without saying a word. My father would try to invite old family friends over for a barbecue without asking, but I would intercept the calls and inform the guests that the house was unavailable for entertaining. Each time they hit a wall, they looked at me with a mix of confusion and burgeoning respect, as if they were seeing a person they didn't recognize. The house rules were not just on paper. They were a living barrier that protected my newfound peace. My mother found it increasingly difficult to live in a space where her voice was not the law. She spent most of her time on the deck staring at the ocean, her phone silent, because she had nothing to brag about to her friends. She couldn't post photos of the house as her own, because she knew I was watching her social media and would comment with a correction in a heartbeat. The entitlement that had fueled her for decades was starving in the face of my consistency. She became quieter, and for the first time I saw her look old and out of place. One evening over a dinner that was thick with unspoken thoughts, my father finally asked me why I had gone to such lengths to document our history. I told him that I needed to see the truth in black and white so that I would never doubt my own sanity again. I explained that for years, they had made me feel like I was the one who was failing, when in reality, I was the one who was funding their failures. My father looked down at his plate and didn't argue. It was the first time I felt he truly understood the cost of his silence. The atmosphere shifted from a battle of wills to a somber recognition of a fractured relationship that might never fully heal. As the 30-day deadline approached, the air in the house grew lighter for me, but heavier for them. They began to realize that I wasn't going to offer them a permanent extension. The rental agreement was reaching its end, and I had already prepared a list of local realtors and long-term rentals in a nearby town that was more within their actual budget. My mother tried one last time to cry and use her health as a reason to stay through the winter, but I simply handed her the contact information for a highly rated clinic near the new apartment I had found for them. The choice was clear: they could accept my help as an independent daughter, or they could continue to fight a war they had already lost. The morning of the 30th day arrived with a crisp breeze and a clear horizon. There was no need for a final confrontation or a dramatic speech, because the folders on the table had already said everything that needed to be said. My parents stood in the entryway, surrounded by the same suitcases they had brought with them, but the energy they carried was completely different. The arrogance that had fueled their arrival a month ago had been replaced by a quiet, somber realization. They weren't leaving because they had been kicked out. They were leaving because they had finally been confronted with the reality of a daughter they could no longer control or guilt into submission. I watched as my father loaded the SUV. He moved slowly, and for once he didn't look for me to help him with the heavy bags. He seemed to finally accept that his role as the passive observer of my mother's manipulation had cost him a genuine connection with me. My mother stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the ocean that had been my witness throughout this entire ordeal. She looked smaller and less formidable in the morning light. She didn't offer a fake apology, and I didn't ask for one. We both knew that the contract was fulfilled and that the boundaries I had drawn in the sand were now carved in stone. As they walked toward the car, my mother stopped and looked back at me one last time. She didn't call me selfish or ungrateful. Instead, she simply said that I had grown up to be much more like her than she ever expected. I smiled because I knew she meant it as an insult, but to me it was proof of my survival. I had taken her strength and her iron will, and I had used them to protect myself from her. I told them to drive safely and reminded them that I would always love them, but that my house would always be a sanctuary for my peace and never a playground for their drama. I watched the SUV pull out of the driveway and disappear down the coastal road until even the dust had settled. I walked back into my house, and the silence that greeted me was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was light and vast like the ocean itself. I went into the guest room and stripped the bed sheets, reclaiming the space and erasing the last traces of their invasion. I sat on my deck barefoot with a cup of coffee and watched the waves rolling endlessly forward, unstoppable and unapologetic. The fear that had defined my life for 27 years had dissolved into a profound certainty. The welcome I had prepared wasn't about revenge or cruelty. It was about the birth of a woman who finally belonged to herself.